Hi, so my name is Thijs Turel, and I work with the Amsterdam Institute for Advanced Metropolitan Solutions, or the AMS Institute, but I will introduce that later. Let me start out by apologizing to you all for not being physically present. So I wasn't feeling well enough to visit the conference, simply that's the thing. And for now, a couple of painkillers and some caffeine will probably allow me to get through my presentation and tell you a little bit of what we're doing in Amsterdam. And also in advance, I want to apologize for any repetitiveness that might be there in my talk, because I have no way of knowing what's already been said during the last 2 days. I had a look, of course, at the program, and I saw very interesting contributions by, for instance, Peter Mantello on ethical AI in public places, and also some work by Laura Büttner on the urban data governance in Hamburg, which are sure topics, I think, that could lie very closely to what I will be presenting today. But sadly, I wasn't there. So if I repeat stuff, apologies in advance. I will be speaking today to you. The title of my presentation was Designing a Smart City from kind of a European values perspective. But I put European between brackets because I thought I can maybe do better in terms of a title than that. I can do better in terms of being more inclusive, because I think many of the values I will be talking about are not particularly European. And maybe I can also be more to the point, because there's actually a specific subset of values that I want to talk about. But more about that later. So as of after 2 years of the pandemic, I'm kind of still not used to do this kind of remote talk to people, an audience that you cannot really connect with that well. It still kind of feels awkward, but I'm pretty confident that we've all been in this spot at one point or another. So that kind of feels good. But still, it was kind of weird for me to not know at all what type of audience I would be addressing. And as of 15 minutes before this presentation, we weren't quite sure whether there would be any footage possible to the connection. So now I can look into the room a little bit, but I didn't know that. So I kind of wanted to conjure up an image of my audience. And I was playing around with this OpenAI beautiful piece of software called DALL-E 2, which generates images. So what I basically did at the start was to ask what you guys would look like. So I put into this machine the question, can you show me an audience at a conference on cities in Prague in photorealistic style? And this is partly the image of how I am seeing you right now and what I'm kind of addressing. But fortunately, I can also look into the lecture hall a little bit at times when the camera is showing the right connection. So that's kind of my connection to you guys, and Valeria will be assisting me in fielding any questions that might be coming up during the talk and forwarding them to me. So please do not be shy in that, because it's easier to connect. So my main message for today is actually the following. So I would like to tell you or show you that we do not just need functional technology, or functional urban technology, but we need this technology to function in a particular way, which to me is fitting with the ideal of a sovereign liberal democracy and the values that is associated with. And the good thing, I think, is even though we're not quite there yet in all circumstances, but we can design for that. And I'll be talking you through this kind of thesis or this key message for, I think, 30 minutes, 35 minutes, and then we can do Q&A. So the structure is I will simply be telling you a little bit of what's going on in digitization realm, in mobility and public space in Amsterdam. I'll be sharing some of the worries that we are having on the developments and that are taking. I want to show you a little bit what we in Amsterdam are doing to work to what we call responsible urban digitization. And then I want to show you this project I'm representing here as well, which is called the Responsible Sensing Lab. And a couple of projects that we're building on to operationalize values in smart cities. And that will lead me to the conclusion. So a little bit on AMS Institute. We are a bit of a standout institute, because people always tell me that something like this doesn't exist in very many places in the world. But we're actually a collaboration between 3 universities, the University of Delft, of Wageningen, and MIT in Massachusetts, and the City of Amsterdam. And the institute was founded based on a tender by the City of Amsterdam, which said we want a more technical institute in Amsterdam that helps us work through upcoming urban problems, and that's what we're doing. So we are connecting the real practical problems of the city to academia, basically, and particularly in our 3 founding institutes. And we do that in the center of Amsterdam, work on themes ranging from energy through mobility, through digitization, to urban food and logistics. So that, in a nutshell, is what I'm working with. So I'm technically being paid by the university, but I sometimes feel more like a civil servant in the city. So I think in some way that kind of shows that the intermediate position is that they try to create a kind of works in a way, because I'm supposed to feel kind of problem owner for both these stakeholder groups. Yeah, so digitization in Amsterdam. So what's happening there? So the key thing is that the model that seems to be lying under a lot of developments is something, I guess, that you will all be familiar with, is this idea of imposing an idea of a control loop on managing the city. So the idea to sense stuff in public space, to analyze, to see whether that is what you want out of it or not, and then if not, maybe steer in a particular direction, to try to automate this loop, and then also apply it to diverse domains, such as mobility problems, but also energy problems and all that stuff like that. And we are in Amsterdam kind of doing our best, and also getting a lot of pilots, but also business as usual solutions that we have. So to show you just some ideas of what's happening, we are quite doing a lot in the field of crowd management. Just as Prague, Amsterdam is a very touristy city, especially in the red light districts. So we have built this rather elaborate sensing system that shows where it's really crowded, and then kind of triggers a real-time response right now in the form of human hosts that will come and point people the other way. But we're also working towards dynamic signage. So in one situation, the central station would be going that way, and in another the central station would be that way, depending on the crowdedness in the city. We do a lot on intelligent traffic access, which is actually something that in other cities, they're way forward. With Amsterdam, we're also going to be doing this. Another topic that we're working on right now is to see if we can integrate kind of advice on how people travel throughout the city in navigation apps, such as TomTom or Google Maps or Waze, all these things. So can we weigh in the route that people take, can we maybe weigh some public interests? For instance, to make sure that cars don't go past primary schools when the schools are opening and closing. That's something we're working on. And also some stuff in the field of safety and security, such as piloting a little bit whether sound and enhancing, or kind of whether surveillance cameras can be in some way made more effective by having noise triggers or some things like that. So to show you a little bit what's happening. And all in all, I think this pretty much fits into the general idea of smart cities, or the classical idea of smart cities, let's put it like that, as systems that are supposed to bring more efficiency to the city, to get more value out of the same amount of taxpayer money, or hopefully even less money, to be able to do your maintenance of the city more efficiently, to optimize the use of limited infrastructures, such as the electricity grid or the road system. And that's all in all, I think, very good, because that's definitely the type of solution that we need in this century, because cities are getting more crowded. Then again, there are also some things that worry us a bit about this digitization that's taking place in public space and of the city of Amsterdam. And well, I was trained as a political scientist, so I thought for this talk, maybe frame it in that perspective, right? So we aspire to a particular way of governance, I would say, in at the European part of the world, in the Netherlands, definitely for sure, which is democratic, liberal, and sovereign. So I'll talk you through these concepts, because I guess democratic is the most familiar for all of you, or maybe there's less chance of misunderstanding. But that's basically the idea of governing by the people and for the people. So the idea that the people themselves kind of decide upon how big tech is actually being applied, or technology is applied in their city. But we don't just want to do that in a democratic way. We want to do that in what's called a liberal democratic way, which is that we want to respect kind of human freedoms and liberties, right? So we don't want to be a democracy that, I don't know, throws people under the bus if the majority plus one agrees on that, right? We want to be prevented from those type of risks. And the third thing that I think from a political science perspective really stands out is the idea, especially from international relations, that we want to be a sovereign state. So the idea is that this democratically liberal run state is in full control of what's happening on its jurisdiction. So that means that itself can do it, and for instance, not very large technological companies from somewhere else or other states or all these things. And I think these three words kind of capture very well also what can go wrong in this smart city paradigm. So the first example is, I think, one that's mentioned quite often here, but I would also like to use to demonstrate can go wrong democratically, which is basically the huge pushback that this sidewalk labs initiative, development in Toronto, kind of got by the local community when a large part or large area was basically being given out to a private party to develop, and a lot of activists and other people in the government in the area simply didn't like that way of operating or developing a city. So that kind of went wrong there, and that's one of the examples. And we have our own kind of versions or smaller versions of that problem in Amsterdam as well, where people feel kind of left out of the discussion. A second thing, I guess, an example I would like to mention is the way how social control and social order is being enforced in China at this moment. Where there was recently a lot of interesting publications in the New York Times, but also in the Washington Post about this, how there's an increasing use of profiling, so predicting which people might be, protesters might not be agreeing with the current government of China and could at some point be coming to Beijing to protest. And it turned out that in several cases, these journalists were saying that people are simply at certain occasions being prevented from being able to travel to the city center of Beijing in the first place through the use of the elaborate kind of corona enforcement mechanism that the government there built. So people simply were getting an app that showed up red, and that made sure that they couldn't enter taxis and buses, but actually they hadn't been in situations that were very corona proof, or that there was not that risk. They felt it was really because of their political opinions like that. And this kind of clearly is something that I think in Amsterdam we do not want, because it doesn't resonate with the idea of this individual autonomy, of freedom of movement, of privacy, and all these liberal values that we have here. And the third thing is something that is related to sovereignty, and I like a nice example here from me is what happened during the pandemic, when it turned out that national governments actually were reliant upon software updates that had to be done by Apple and Google to have an effective corona tracing mechanism, because it turned out that there was a particular setting in these operating systems having to do something with whether you can run Bluetooth checks as a background process or as a foreground process. That wasn't the case up till that moment, and governments really had to rely on the goodwill of these two large corporations to do that. And as a political scientist, kind of thinking of the ideal of sovereignty, that's not how things are supposed to go. So you would ideally want to have control of these things. So in a way, you can see that there are some examples where this kind of smart city technology can actually lead to illiberal, undemocratic, and unsovereign situations. And I think there are many cases where it's not going that far, but these are kind of risks that we need to keep in mind, and also be aware very much of, that we want to be preventing these risks. And also, if you're not familiar with these themes, it's also, you can also think about this kind of as big government to be something, or the idea of big brother, that we want to prevent on the one hand a government that's too powerful, but also the discussions on big tech that might be more familiar terms. But this is kind of how I see this. So I'm moving on then to what we are doing to see that we get this more responsible version of digitization in Amsterdam. And I would like to go back a little bit in time to the year 2017, where at that time it was really the start where the mainstream media started, in my experience, to be more critical of what technology was actually bringing to our society. 2014, 2015, when you looked at the newspaper, at least when I did that, most of the news was still very much about there is a new iPhone, the number is X, and it has the following new features, Y, Z, and X. And only in 2017, around that time, kind of the mainstream media got more critical. It was the time where Uber really came up, I think, Airbnb came up. And in Amsterdam, as a response in 2017, a large group of civil society organizations actually joined, and they started voicing their worries about how technology would be shaping their city. And they came up with a list of so-called tada values. So tada doesn't stand for anything. It just sounds nice. That's the way how they chose it. But these are the values that then were kind of thought up. So the idea of inclusiveness, that everybody can kind of be part of it. The idea that there should be meaningful control over technology, that it should be kind of designed for people and not for big systems, that it should be open and transparent so we can scrutinize it basically, that it should also be legitimate and monitored, and that it should be kind of open access, so everybody should really benefit from these things. And that's kind of the terms that these civil societies came up with, and they made these very friendly icons of that too, as part of the campaign around this. Now, and the interesting thing that then happened is that these values actually became part of the so-called Amsterdam Coalition Agreement. So that's the top-level policy document, if you will, that the mayor and the vice mayors promised to carry out during their reign of the city. And if you see here in the excerpt just below on the screen, it actually says you there. It's in Dutch, but I'll translate that we want to have these tada values or principles, and we also want to implement them in our city. Which is kind of interesting because you must have thought by yourself, these terms are very nice, but they're also not very concrete yet, right? So what does that mean? But it's there in the policy document. So we need to do that as a city of Amsterdam, which is an interesting move, I think, because it also gives a lot of people a license to operate in that space, right? I mean, a lot of people are working on efficiency problems. So how can we make sure that garbage is being collected more efficiently, or all these or roads run more smoothly. But now there's also policy that says we need to think about these values. And when you think about these values, and I bring you back to my triangle, you can actually see that they map out pretty well. So there's a lot that I would associate with democracy. There's a lot that I would associate with the ideal of liberalism, basically. That's political liberalism, then not economic liberalism. And the idea of sovereignty, so the idea of control of technology. So it's really not any type of values or human values, but it's a very particular set of values that people are worried that they might not be designed enough into these systems. One of the things that is very important is the fact that democracy requires transparency. If you want to have an effective system of checks and balances, people need to be able to know what's going on, so they can form their opinions on that, and then maybe also protest against that or go to their council members. And that's something that hasn't been designed very well in a lot of these algorithmic or sensing systems in the city. So there's three main things here happening, I think, in Amsterdam at this point in time. And I thank you so much. I'll be briefly mentioning the first two, and I'll be deep diving into the third one. So one of the things that we did is, if you want to have transparency on a city that is using algorithms to run, particular processes in the city, it's good to make that public. So the city of Amsterdam, together with a lot of other stakeholders, actually designed this thing called an algorithm registry, which is publicly available. So all algorithms that kind of impact citizens are described in a particular way that's checked, so they can be scrutinized and understood by citizens, which is a very helpful thing to be offering transparency. But as part of the process of setting up that registry, it quickly became apparent that actually in a lot of situations, the city actually doesn't know what these algorithms do or how they work, because they're being provided by market parties. And there you went into an interesting situation of a public procurer needing to be able to provide transparency, and a private contractor not willing to give this transparency because of IP reasons, right? So they did a lot of work with a lot of legal scholars and legal people, and they managed to find themselves into a set of contract clauses that are more or less acceptable to both parties. So that give private contractors enough securities that their IP will not be violated easily, but that give the government a possibility to look into how certain algorithms work on a so-called procedural level, but also on a technical level. So there are clauses there that if the city really thinks something is not going right, that they reserve the right to have a third party look into actual source code. That's an interesting thing that's happening. And that's right now also being drawn up, these contract clauses, to also be able to work in the EU context. So right now they were drawn up for Dutch law, but they will also be drawn up for Dutch law, and I believe also including the upcoming AI Act and what's mentioned there. A second thing that's happening in Amsterdam is this so-called sensor registry, which you see indicated on this map here. Part of these systems are also kind of sensors that happen in the system. And the city simply started mapping out all the cameras and all these sensors and noise sensors and all these things. They operate in public space and making that available on a map through citizens. And as of, I think, last year, it also became mandatory for commercial parties which operate cameras or sensors in public space to tell that to the city. So they don't need a license, but they need to inform the city that they are using these things to also put on this map and to kind of keep these systems at bay. And then the third thing, which is what I spend most of my time on, is the so-called Responsible Sensing Lab, which I will be diving into right now. So looking at the time, I'm 20 minutes in, that's fine. So I will want to tell you a little bit about our way of working. I want to tell you something about 2 or 3 of the design sprints that we're undertaking in this laboratory. So what we do, we actually took on the challenge that was phrased in the coalition agreement to explore how you can operationalize these values in a meaningful way in the design of smart city systems. That's what we're doing. And who we are is actually a collaboration between academia, AMS Institute, and the city of Amsterdam. So we have legal experts, we have people who work very well with hardware, we have designers, we have people who are more on the social side, so a network that represents all aspects of these smart city networks that we are building. And we collaborate with them in design sprints, depending on the topic we establish kind of a team. So then how do we see responsible, which is a nice phrase? Well, in one way, kind of the lab was set up to figure out what that means exactly. What does responsible mean when it comes to kind of urban sensing technologies and urban control loops, all these things. But as a working definition, we actually use the work by Ivo van der Poel, which is basically kind of one is about a particular process. So a process that includes stakeholders and people who can be the subjects of these systems, who actually have to deal with the consequences. So people kind of on the other end of the stick. Maybe that's a bit too negative of a framing, but these type of people. And also be thinking a little bit more about the long-term impact. So not just about what type of revenue or cost saving you can establish in the next 2 years, but also what could happen after that and where it will lead to. And the second definition is simply innovating from values. And those are the values that I just showed you a couple of slides back. And we try to integrate these two. So both work from values, but also see if we can include stakeholders relatively soon in the process and see how they feel about what we're doing. So what we work on is the following. So if you see this kind of this diagram, this is the classic Amsterdam image of a person with 2 kids in a cargo bike that you see really often here. But what does a smart city mean for them, right? And the things they can actually see is what you see in this image, right? There's the traffic lights, the stuff that enable you to do something or prohibit you from doing something. And there's these kind of sensing things like cameras in this image. And that's kind of what citizens can actually see right now. But as you all are very well aware of, that's just the tip of the iceberg, so to say. There's a whole lot of other stuff happening behind the scenes when it comes about cloud computing, about servers, about processing onwards, all these dashboard controls. There's a whole lot, but that's something that people actually can't see. So we think about actually design interventions in 4 spaces. We think about what you can do on the algorithmic level to in some way operationalize these values. What you can do in terms of hardware, and a very important one, the user interface design, or maybe the citizen or the city interface design. So what should it actually look like in a city? Because right now it's just gray boxes, right? That's what you see of a smart city. And also a little bit governance, so local regulations and all these things. This is kind of the knobs we try to tweak by our work. So we work according to this innovation funnel where we first start conceptualizing, thinking a little bit about how would a particular, new application of, I don't know, surveillance camera technology, how does that exactly go together with the value of privacy? And how does a system that tries to guide traffic more and more efficiently through the city, how does that go together with the concept or the ideal of autonomy? Because that isn't kind of clearly always on the same page. And when we find kind of an interesting combination, then we start designing stuff. That basically looks like stuff like this. I'll be showing you a little bit more like that. Then we start prototyping, though that can be physical objects, but also lines of code, can also be policy regulations. And we try to go into kind of achieving real life impact. So cities typically don't produce their own technology. In some cases they do, but largely they simply buy that. So we try to kind of a theory of changes, or we try to create impact usually by changing these tender requirements. So if you can specify what type of smart city kind of system you prefer more than others, you can write this into your tendering process, and then the private contractors will need to in some way include that in their products and services. But sometimes also developing open source and kind of other type of impacts. So, and as a side project or something that's also very important, we try to produce academic knowledge. So in terms of papers, but also in terms of getting new subsidy proposals off the ground, new coalitions, all these type of things. Well, we try to do this in a kind of evidence-based way, because as you can understand, the values that are so abstract, they can be explained in manifold ways, and they might be meaning something really different to you than to me. So how then do you know whether a particular way of operationalizing values actually makes sense, right? Because you need to do that in order to justify spending public monies and actually making these things part of the system. So we do that typically by looking at the city hall perspective of technology, but also at the public perspective. And when you're looking at the public, then we typically think about things, does it work better for the public on a particular value, looking at experts, but also others. And dealing with the general public, we find, can be really, well, complex really, because a lot of people do not care very much about these things. That's our kind of impression right now. So we have developed several strategies to do that by simply focusing on the people who kind of self-identify as privacy-minded people, or people who are really scared of the risks of big government or kind of big tech. We sometimes in our design sprints illustrate these values or illustrate the tensions that might arise. Sometimes we ask people for their own values, and we try to do this in such a way that we can in the end actually justify the extra public expenditure to also include these values. Let me make it a little bit more concrete by diving into the first example. So this is a project that we're doing right now, which is called Shutter Cam. So this starts with the problem that there's simply an increasing amount of cameras in the city. Because there's many use cases that you can actually use cameras for, and a lot of departments at the city, whether they're into spatial planning or into garbage removal or other things, they like cameras because they offer them information. So if I were J.J.R. Tolkien, I sometimes think, the author of Lord of the Rings, I would by now call the camera kind of the sensor to rule them all, right? That's the thing, because it can be reprogrammed, it can be kind of collecting any type of information, and for that sake is really very good for the city. But in Amsterdam, we have a tension there, because the same coalition agreement that I just mentioned also has a phrase in it that says that people should be able to go through public space unobserved. Well, that's a huge kind of mismatch there, obviously. If you on the one hand start putting more of these cameras in the street, but also promise people that they should be able to go through public space unobserved. So we were thinking from these values such as transparency and control, but also the idea of legitimacy and kind of being able to monitor the government back, what we can do here. And we came up with a very simple intervention, which is so simple that you probably won't believe me. So the idea is, can we do something just like a webcam shutter? And I guess after 2 years of pandemic, you all must be appreciating your own shutters. We also, these movies in the first months of the pandemic, where people were in various states of undress in front of the webcam, kind of convinced that these cams were off. But a shutter is kind of something that is really, really intuitive. Anybody understands that. So if you want to have kind of a more democratic system of checks and balances, so a system of checks and balances that is just not understandable by privacy activists or legal people, you need to think of interventions that anybody can understand. And it's not just intuitive, it's also in a way trustless, right? Because if you see a red light blinking next to your webcam, then what does it mean, right? Is it recording? Is it not recording? But a shutter kind of, because it's so easy to understand, it's also in a way, it doesn't, well, you don't need that much of trust. You can simply kind of assume that the camera isn't filming. And we thought this up first kind of as a thought experiment to show kind of what we meant by redesigning these smart city systems, but we actually started working on it a little bit. Oh yeah, one thing I should explain. So which cameras am I talking about exactly? So in a kind of a schematic way, we can in the city see some cameras that simply should always be on. And on the other end of the continuum, there are cameras that can actually be switched off without meaningful loss of data, right? So if you're not that much into abstract categorization, such as this, the first one could be, I don't know, surveillance camera at an embassy, something like that, that needs to be on all the time, because otherwise it kind of defeats the purpose of the thing being there. But for instance, an example of D is, for instance, the cameras in Amsterdam that we use for remote bridge opening. These cameras by design are like off 99.999% of the time, because somebody only actually looks at them if you call a phone number and then they remotely operate the bridge. And it turns actually out that there's a relatively, there's many kind of cameras that fall under category C and D, so that you can do something. So we started experimenting with that a bit. And here you see three iterations of what we did in this space. Iteration one was just kind of a very simple prototype that we did in our office. So the idea was we had this Arduino that was kind of connected to an automatic timer, and then it would sometimes cover this webcam that was behind this piece of wood, and sometimes it wouldn't. And what we felt when we did this with colleagues, kind of that people thought, well, this is rather naive, let's put it like that, but we find it intriguing as well, because it's also something, I mean, there's something there, it does offer some kind of guarantee and something. So maybe you should pursue this. Then we went a little bit further. We did a second iteration, and we did this on the marine terrain in the city of Amsterdam, which is a large piece of publicly accessible land, but that's privately owned, so we can set up experiments there quickly. And they had a camera system there that did crowd counting, so to see how crowded it was, because it's summer days, sometimes it's just packed with the people swimming. You see the swimming water kind of blurred out in the image here. And we did actually three concepts. So one is kind of a camera with a fixed and advertised schedule. So the schedule would be saying it will be open on these and these times, and it will be closed at these and these times. And we, as your monitors, kind of will promise to stick to that schedule. You can check it because we publish the schedule. The second one was the same one then, but with a button. And the third one was with a wind-up clock. So to go with the button first, we thought, can we not simply give people kind of an opt-out mechanism? So if they're going there for a swim and they don't like to be kind of in front of a camera in their bathing clothes, why not press the button and then we'll switch it off for 30 minutes. And after 30 minutes, so then the lid dropped, and after 30 minutes it went back up. And then people could have had their swim and they wouldn't have been in the camera's view, right? So that's one thing we did. And another thing was the wind-up mechanism, which was about, well, many people at the time were saying that it's simply becoming too cheap for government to be using cameras at scale, and also too easy. And then we think maybe we can design some friction back into the process. And in this case, by requiring the operator of this crowd counting camera to go back every 7 days physically to this location to rewind the camera, so to say, right? So you can imagine these kind of old-fashioned clocks, a little bit like that. So the idea is maybe should we design some friction back into the system to make it not too easy to be watching people at scale? And that's also something we did. So what happened? Well, privacy professionals seem to be fairly positive of it. There were people who were part of watchdog organizations and that were very critical. And they said, well, this is exactly just going to be an excuse for even more cameras. But these were the people who were still unpaid there. And I also spoke to one of the people who wasn't paid anymore by the watchdog organization. And he said behind the scenes, actually, this is a great idea. I know it's just small, but it's a step, right? We should do this. So that was kind of fun. There were some commercial operators that were interested because they clearly could see kind of a market demand with other municipalities. Well, and the general public that we asked, we did a lot of surveys and stuff like that. They were kind of mixed, but people who identified as privacy kind of conscious, they liked it. They think this is a nice intervention. So we decided to go for a third run, and this time a little bit more professional. So in an actual operational setting, a crowd counting system that's being used during soccer matches. To make sure that traffic runs smoothly outside of the Johan Cruyff soccer stadium in Amsterdam. And we do this with an industry partner that helped us kind of set up this system. And there we just did the one concept. And this pilot is kind of still running. So I think that's kind of one of the examples. And looking at the time, I'll be skipping to the third. No, maybe first the kind of the conclusions, and then I'll do a piece of the third. And then I think, Valeria, I want to see if there are some questions. And if not, I have some questions for you guys. So as of yet, what do we make of this? So on the plus side, kind of, well, people understand this, right? I mean, that might be trivial, but still it's good to know that from a lot of surveys, people see the fact that when the shutter covers the camera, it kind of works. People also say kind of it raises the bar for the idea that every camera needs to be on 24/7 during the daytime. The bad thing is that, well, it cannot apply to all cameras. There's a lot happening in the realm of kind of surveillance. And I mean, we all have a smartphone as well with us to track our locations. So there's obviously a lot happening as well that is not being covered by this solution, but it's a start. And many people, well, they don't simply care about this particular problem. But then again, I think with the environmental solutions and the carbon emissions, that was the same 40 years back. So for me, this is still a problem that's on the rise. Open questions that we still have is whether we should actually make this extra public expenditure by requiring certain cameras to be kind of shutter outfitted, and should we suggest this in tender requirements? It's something we're still working on during the next pilot. I'm going to skip this one on the, this is a technological solution, kind of designed for privacy, but I will be going to the third one because I think that will be interesting for now because it's a little bit different. Yeah, another topic is the increasing use of scan cars in the city. So in Amsterdam, we've been using, I think for 10 years now, scanning cars or camera cars, I should say, for traffic and for parking enforcement. So if you don't pay your parking fees, then you're going to get fined, and you're going to get fined because this car drives around and it gives you, it recognizes your license plate, and the process starts to check whether you paid, and if you didn't pay, you get a fine. That's kind of how it works. And that led to a huge increase in revenue for the city. It led to a large amount of less people that we needed overall. It improved the efficiency of the system hugely. So hugely, in fact, that there's right now a lot of other use cases that are also being kind of thought up and actually worked on. So there's the idea of geolocating garbage, particularly garbage that could be reused, right? So old fridges or wooden couches, all these things that where you actually want to spread the material streams. Then it might be very helpful to know where these old couches or fridges or whatever are. A big problem in Amsterdam, which you might have even picked up through international media, is the fact that our beautiful quay walls are right now rapidly crumbling because of the increased traffic that we have in the city over the last decades. And a problem is even that people simply put too big sea containers on these quay walls for construction processes. So the city also wants to know where these are and then maybe see if people actually have their permit for that. And the third thing that's also happening, and I can go on with this, but just to give you an impression that under Amsterdam local rules, you can actually tax commercial organizations for advertisements in public space, a process that was actually costing more than it was earning in revenue from the city when it was done by hand. But now with scan cars, maybe you can kind of change the balance a little bit. So there's a lot of new use cases. And kind of when these scan cars will be kind of become more familiar in the city and being used for more and more stuff, then the question arises, how would you actually design the interaction between citizens and this scan car, right? Because right now it's sometimes blinded, it's just driving around. It's all in all not a very nice kind of thing to do. I mean, it's kind of an enforcement thing. So how can we give people kind of back meaningful control? That's a pilot we will be doing in the next 2 years. A nice schema. I'll skip this for now and go into what I wanted to say about it. Yeah, so a couple of pilots that we will be doing on kind of the way how people can kind of feed into the algorithms that do the machine vision classification, such as is this garbage or not? Should we pick this garbage up? Yes or no? So if you see the kind of the machine vision pipeline on the top of this image that goes from recognizing something and then kind of seeing what it actually is and then triggering a process that leads to some action in the city, garbage being picked up, somebody being fined, a tax bill being sent, all these things. How can citizens play a role in this? Can we in some way open up the process, right? So for instance, with garbage, can maybe citizens help train the data set? Can they help identify what we should classify as garbage and what we shouldn't? Because that's not always that obvious in the city. Can they maybe help us sort out false positives and negatives, right? can they maybe add to the data set? There might be situations where kind of this scan car is coming and it would always, its view would always be kind of blocked by a particular tree or something like that. And maybe people can take a picture of for themselves and upload that into this machine vision pipeline, also triggering this process. So can we somehow make this machine vision or this kind of this system more participatory by its nature to make sure that citizens can work with it, that it does better what they want, but also in some way kind of demystifying this and ultimately kind of leading to more trust, hopefully, in these systems. So I'm going to skip this one. This is more about the understandability of these scan cars. That's also something we should be working on, because if they're not doing parking control, but they could be doing anything, how do you know what they're doing then at that time? Moving on to my conclusion. So my main point I already kind of gave away at the start. I think we need functional technology, but we need to think this through also from sovereign, liberal, and democratic values. And that's something you can actually do. And some more nuance to bring to that. So I guess it's possible. I hope I showed that. But we notice that the steps we're taking are really slow and incremental right now. And we kind of hope that we will be working towards larger steps, right? Because after all, a shutter is just a shutter. But can we in some way, can that shutter in combination with a whole lot of other interventions enable a system of checks and balances and of transparency and of trust that will kind of work for citizens? So we expect these larger steps and multiple interventions at a later stage. Well, this research methodology to know whether you operationalize a value in a way that makes sense for a city is something that just needs more work, because it's not kind of consumer research where it's really obvious, do you want to buy this brand new Google product or not, right? That's something that brings you a benefit. But this is about a kind of a collective benefit that's being put to the table, and then who's to be the judge of that, right? That's difficult. And that relates very much to the fourth question that we always have. So at some point, we want to make the case for extra public expenses, because if you want to make a scan car process kind of more participatory, or you want to outfit a camera with shutters, or you want to swap cameras for sensors that actually only collect the data that they really need for crowdedness, it's probably going to cost something. And do we want to spend that as a city, or do we just want to go for the efficiency? Well, that was it from my end. I would like to thank you very much for your bearing with me through this.